My name is Dr. Shahom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. Now, I just very recently heard about this horrific, just horrible case of this poor woman, Shakira Spencer, who was basically tortured to death. So I thought I'd make this video because there's a lot going on that I think is quite interesting psychologically. So in this video, I'm going to take you through the background details of the case by showing you another video. And then I'm going to be assessing or psychoanalyzing, both from the victim's perspective, why did Shakira allow this to happen? And also potentially from the perpetrator's perspective, why did they all kind of gang up together, and was there an element of peer pressure? But anyway, let's get straight into the video, and then you can hear my comments at the end.
3 people have been found guilty of murdering a vulnerable woman who was tortured, starved, and treated like a slave over many months, reducing her to a gaunt and skeletal appearance. Shakira Spencer died after falling under the influence of her former neighbor Ashana Studham, 38, her partner Sean Pendlebury, 26, and their friend Lisa Richardson, 44. The defendants from West London folded her feet and fed her only ketchup from sachets, the Old Bailey was told. Over many months, she was isolated, prostituted, and robbed of her self-respect and finances, it was claimed. Spencer would be woken up in the early hours to clean the defendants' houses and send on errands to the shops. The 35-year-old went from being a beautiful, happy, healthy size 16 to a gaunt and skeletal size 6 shortly before her death, jurors heard. Last September, her badly decomposed body was found after neighbors saw maggots coming from her flat in Ealing, West London. The 3 defendants had denied murder and preventing Spencer's lawful burial. On Monday, a jury found all 3 defendants guilty of both charges against them. Pendlebury reacted by clapping his hands and walking out of the dock. Previously, jurors heard how Spencer had been subdued and dominated mainly by Studham and Richardson, to the point where she was under all of their complete control. Prosecutor Alison Hunter Casey said, in early 2021, Shakira Spencer had been a healthy, even voluptuous, size 16, weighing some 74 kilograms, 11 st 9 pounds. By July 2022, Shakira Spencer was just skin and bone, gaunt and skeletal, bruised from head to foot, with hollowed black eyes. She was barely a scrawny size 6 in images taken by the defendants just before she died. For whatever was their unfathomable, cruel, sadistic motive, these 3 defendants tormented, tortured, starved, burned, and eventually battered Shakira Spencer to death. The abuse reached a frenzied climax on around 11 or 12th of September last year when Spencer was beaten to the brink of death at Studham's home, the jury was told. She was bundled into the boot of Pendlebury's borrowed Honda Civic car and driven back to her flat, where she was locked in a hallway cupboard, it was claimed. Underset ice was packed around Spencer in a primitive bid to slow decomposition. Newspapers were carefully laid on the floor next to the bed as if Spencer had been reading and died in her sleep, jurors heard. Underset, it was only...
I'm just going to interrupt. I don't know what to say. Apart from using the adjective horrific, brutal, I don't know what else to say. It's just so cold and calculated, wasn't it? It was not just something that happened by accident. It was like this campaign of just vitriol, hatred, and torture over many, many months. And then even after the event, even after they killed her, they tried to cover up the fact by using ice, putting newspapers there. There's just not even one atom of empathy within any of these people, is there?
When neighbors saw maggots crawling out from under her door, that the police were called to Shakira's address on Sunday, September 25, 2022, and the painstaking investigation which ensued revealed in detail what they had done. Jurors heard Studham had 3 previous convictions for assaulting women in Edinburgh and London, as well as multiple shoplifting offenses. She also received a caution for the neglect of a child who fell from a roof while playing in a paddling pool unattended. Pendlebury had previous convictions for drugs offenses, handling stolen goods, and assaulting 2 police officers, while Richardson had 1 conviction for cultivating cannabis. After the guilty verdicts, Judge Angela Rafferty Casey adjourned sentencing to a later date. Devi Karan, senior Crown prosecutor, said evidence presented during the trial proved that Pendlebury, Studham, and Richardson exercised twisted and sadistic control of Shakira Spencer over an extended...
So just a quick point, just in case you're wondering, the reason why you have like a guilty, somebody in one court hearing, there's the guilty verdict. Why is there a delay for sentencing? So why doesn't the judge just sentence them there and then? They know that they're guilty. And the answer to that is because it gives the defense an opportunity to bring up relevant factors. Now, I'm not saying in any way that they deserve this, but I'm just saying that, for example, as a forensic psychiatrist, if there is an issue in another case where somebody has a mental illness, the defense might want to take that opportunity to get somebody like myself to assess the perpetrators, to assess the offenders, to see if they had, a psychotic disorder that was forcing their actions, and they had decreased culpability. So they might have a hospital order, or it might add in mitigation to a low sentence. So again, just to be crystal clear, I'm not saying that this should or will happen in this case. I'm just saying that that's the reason it's delayed. And another reason it's delayed is because it gives the probation services an opportunity to figure out the likelihood of reoffending, the various factors that were at play. So, for example, peer pressure, drug and alcohol issues. And again, this could equate to mitigating circumstances in some cases. So the judge might be more sympathetic when it comes to the actual length of the prison sentence. So again, I don't think any of that is relevant in this case, but that's in general, the process is the defense get a chance to put forward mitigating circumstances, and the probation get a chance to explain to the judge why this person's dangerous or not dangerous, and other external factors that might have contributed.
Period. They spun a web of lies in every effort to hide their actions. The level of suffering that Shakira endured is simply unimaginable. Our thoughts remain with all of Shakira's family and friends. I hope this conviction brings them some sense of justice.
Okay, so the first thing I want to say is absolutely the same as what this dude just said in the video. My thoughts go with Shakira and her, just the thought of what she must have been going through in her final moments. It must have been just mind-blowingly horrible. And my thoughts go to her family, her surviving family as well. Okay, so let's get into some of the psychological analysis. I suppose the biggest question you're probably asking yourself, and is what I'm asking myself, is why did Shakira allow this to happen? She had lots of opportunities where she could have stepped out of this situation. She was outside in the community on her own when she was going to the shops every morning for them, for example. So why didn't she escape? Why didn't she go to the police? And I just want to be 100% crystal clear, because I've learned that YouTube's not always the voice of reason. I'm in no way putting any blame on the victim. I'm not putting any blame on Shakira. This is not her fault. This is 100% the fault of the perpetrators who killed her. But I still think on top of that, it's also fair to say that not everybody would have allowed that to happen. If I was in that situation, I don't think I'd have allowed that to happen. Maybe you feel the same way. So I think there's still scope of exploring the factors, her specific factors of why this happened for such a long period of time. And I think there's a few things going on. So the first thing that came to mind for me was learned helplessness. So that's a psychological phrase, and it's when an individual passively accepts negative or repeated negative things that happen to them. And it was kind of created, the term or the concept was created by a psychologist named Martin Seligman in the 1960s. And what he did is he did these experiments on dogs. I'm sorry to say that dogs and animals were harmed in the making of the theories behind this video. And what would happen is they would have these dogs in a cage, and they would electrocute one particular part of the cage, and there was a barrier that the dogs could jump over. So the dogs very quickly learnt to avoid the electric shocks by jumping over the barrier. Then they closed that barrier so the dogs couldn't escape from the electric shock. So they just had these shocks over and over again. And the interesting bit is that over time, the dogs developed learned helplessness. So over time, they became quite passive, and they didn't try to escape their fate. So even afterwards, when the barrier was put down, the dogs didn't try to attempt to escape from the shocks, even though they could have. So they've learned to be helpless. And Seligman, remarkably, and this definitely wouldn't be allowed nowadays, actually did similar experiments on humans. So they put them through chronic pain, and they put them through like really uncomfortable scenarios, like annoying noises. And again, the same thing happened over time. The humans would not even attempt to avoid these horrible stimuli. They wouldn't attempt to try and problem solve and get themselves out of the situation. And you do see this in some sort of dynamics. So you see it in domestic violence relationships, for example. I'm going to come on to that because I think there's an overlap between Shakira's experience and domestic violence. But before I say that, something that I think I immediately thought about or wondered about was whether Shakira might have a learning disability. Now, just to be crystal clear, I'm not saying she does. In the news articles that I've read, there's no mention of this. I'm just saying, hypothetically speaking, if I was a psychiatrist, this is something, if I was assessing her, if she was still alive, I'd be looking at and I'd be wondering about, because I've seen other cases like this where it is a factor. So a learning disability is basically when somebody has a very low IQ, and it can be mild, moderate, or severe. People with mild learning disabilities usually kind of function in everyday life. For example, they will go to mainstream schools, they might hold down jobs. Usually they struggle like in terms of higher education, so they might have lower level jobs. Mild, severe learning disabilities, on that end of the spectrum, people need a high level of support, so they might not be able to look after themselves, cook meals, budget money, go shopping, etc., etc. So why am I bringing this up? Because again, not in this particular case necessarily, because I simply don't know the answer, but in other cases that I've seen that have been similar to this, people with learning disabilities are more vulnerable, and they're kind of less able to stand up for themselves and less able to understand what's happening to them when they're being bullied, targeted, even tortured. So why is that? Well, if you've got a learning disability, the obvious thing is that you struggle to read and write education. But beyond that, in terms of human behavior, you struggle to process information. So you might not fully even understand that what's happening to you is, cruel. And also they struggle with social skills and acceptable human boundaries. So again, they don't necessarily understand what is happening to them. And on top of all of those things, they might not have the confidence to speak out. They might not understand or acknowledge that if they go to the police, if they ask people for help, that people will help them. It might be an element of learned helplessness and not understanding that they can step out. And this can actually make them quite vulnerable. So in my career as a forensic psychiatrist, I've seen, at least 3 or 4 cases where somebody with a learning disability has been exploited. So off the top of my head, I've seen at least 2 cases where young, vulnerable men with learning disabilities have been kind of recruited by these drug dealing gangs. So they pretend to befriend them. They tell them they're part of the crew, part of the gang. Maybe they give them some weed and some booze, but they befriend them because they want to exploit them. So they use this individual to go and do all the risks in selling the drugs where the gang keep the money. And because they've got a learning disability, they don't understand the concept. They just think that these are their new friends. Just as an aside, this is not relevant to Shakira's case, but I'm going to mention it because I think it's interesting. I've also seen the opposite. So I've seen people with learning disabilities who commit offences because they don't really understand the full impact of what they're doing. So for example, I met a young man who had Down syndrome who would go to the same bus stop, and he would sort of, in a sexualized way, he would touch random strangers, random women, and then he would kind of, when they inevitably would become really shocked and angry, he would sort of run off in a panic. Now, what he's doing is wrong, absolutely, but I don't think he fully understood the impact of his actions. I think he wasn't a predator. His intention wasn't to hurt or to scare these women. It's just that he had like these inner kind of sexual drives, and he didn't know how to express them in a healthy way. And I could tell that when I was assessing him. So he was unable to really understand the concept of the damage that he'd done. He just thought that's how you get a sexual partner. Anyway, so that is going off on a tangent. Back to Shakira's case. Another element, I think, of why Shakira may have stayed in this situation or stayed in like this friendship circle, I think there's a massive overlap with domestic violence. And you could say this is domestic violence. I mean, it's not a romantic relationship, but there's a huge overlap. So why do people like Shakira stay in relationships like this? I think there's a lot of factors. So number one is fear. So they might not believe or have confidence in the fact that if they went to the police or went to friends that it would stop. And in fact, it could be worse. There might be worse future repercussions. And I've seen this so many times with women who have been, abused by their husbands, and then there isn't enough evidence, and the husbands get a slap on the wrist, or they might get a warning or a caution by the police. They might even change their behaviour for a week or two, but inevitably it comes back, and sometimes it's worse to punish the victim. The other thing is, it might be a difficult thing to kind of comprehend, but for people not in this scenario, but it's love and affection. So sometimes people are so vulnerable that that's the only kind of connection that they've got. So they would rather be in a violent relationship than no relationship at all. And I know from other news articles that Shakira was vulnerable, and she was a people pleaser. She very much wanted to stay. She was looking for friends, and she was kind of desperate for company, I think is fair to say, to the point that it might have clouded her judgment. And another very common social thread or factor for people who are victims of domestic violence is a lack of social support. So not only does that mean that they don't have other people to turn to for help, so they don't have people they can confide in, but it also means that they're scared of losing this social connection that they've already got. So they don't want to be alone. They don't want to be lonely. And over time, and remember, these things usually gradually develop this kind of really cruel behavior, and it's hard to know that it's happening to you in some cases. So it's like the slowly boiling frog, right? If you put a frog in boiling water, it will jump out because it's burnt. But if you put it in a cold pan and gradually increase the heat, it can gradually boil and die and not realize, because it's very slow increments. Other reasons that people might stay in domestic violent relationships, not related to Shakira, but I'm just speaking generally to educate you, could be like financial dependency. So I've definitely seen some women who don't feel that they have the resources to leave, or they might be connected due to children or religious beliefs. They don't believe in divorce or separating, or their family might be ashamed of them. These are all the different reasons. Okay, I'm going to change tact and talk a bit about the perpetrator's perspective. So just want to be crystal clear, I don't know enough about these perpetrators. I've tried to do some research, but it doesn't have that much information aside from what you saw in the video. But I do wonder whether there was an element of peer pressure. So I think they're all to blame, and all of them had lots of opportunities to stop, and it was prolonged torture. So every single one of them who's been found guilty did something completely evil inherently. I'm not denying that. But I still think it's also possible from other cases that I've seen that there was one driving force, probably the man. And the others might have played along to a degree. Why? Maybe to fit in with their peers, or maybe because they would feel ostracized if they didn't. So they might be scared into thinking that they would become a target of abuse if they didn't play along. So they might be coerced into participating. And sometimes this happens in a very subtle, non-direct way, and sometimes the other perpetrators can directly threaten them. So this is something that I see a lot in gang violence, and I see it in bullying as well. Now, you might be uncomfortable with that theory, and that's quite reasonable, but the reason I'm bringing it up is because 100%, I guarantee you, it was considered by all three defendants' defense teams. So that would be an obvious thing that a solicitor or a barrister would try and argue, try and find evidence for, because their job is to get the best outcome for their clients. So if that wasn't put forward during the trial, then it would have been considered and ruled out. Okay, so that is basically what I have to say. Once again, tragic, horrible case, and my thoughts go out to Shakira's family and just how brutal it must have been for her and her last moments, and what just a nasty, horrible way to die. Yeah. But anyways, if you want to see some videos on slightly lighter topics, I've recently done one about Dr. Dre and his recent trauma, and I've done another one that I'm yet to release about Busta Rhymes and how he's coped with depression. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments section below, and let me know if there's any specific videos you would like me to react to. Until then, have a blessed day.